December 17th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Obergefreiter Klaus Schneider crouched in a foxhole carved from frozen earth, his hands trembling as he tried to break apart a piece of hardtack that had been in his pack for 3 weeks. The biscuit was so hard that he had to use the butt of his rifle to crack it into smaller pieces. Around him, his squad mates did the same, their faces hollow with exhaustion and hunger. The Ardennes offensive had begun just the day before, and already the promised supplies had failed to materialize. Klaus placed a fragment of the ancient biscuit in his mouth and let his saliva slowly soften it enough to chew. It tasted like dust and cardboard, with a faint chemical aftertaste that never quite went away. This was breakfast. This had been breakfast for longer than he cared to remember. The hardtack in Klaus's pack had been manufactured in October. He knew because the date was stamped on the wrapper, faded but still legible. October 1944, 2 months ago. The biscuits had been designed to last for years if necessary, which was fortunate because the Wehrmacht logistics system operated on the assumption that they would need to. Fresh food was a memory from another life, something Klaus associated with home leave and civilian existence. In the field you ate what didn't spoil, and you were grateful when there was enough of it. Lately there hadn't been enough of it. Across the line, somewhere in the fog and snow, were the Americans. Klaus had been told they were soft, spoiled, unprepared for real war. He had been told their supply lines were stretched thin, that they were running out of everything, that victory was inevitable if the Wehrmacht could just push hard enough, fast enough. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. Because if it wasn't true, then what was the point of eating stale biscuits in a frozen hole while artillery screamed overhead? Feldwebel Ernst Baumann crawled along the trench line, distributing what passed for rations. Each man received 2 more pieces of hardtack, a small tin of unidentifiable meat paste that had been produced in 1942, and a portion of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and chicory. Ernst had been a baker in Cologne before the war. He knew bread. He knew the smell of fresh dough rising, the crack of a perfect crust, the soft warmth of the interior still steaming from the oven. That life seemed like something from another universe now. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd eaten real bread. Months, maybe 6 months, maybe longer. The company had been promised hot meals once they broke through American lines and captured their supply depots. It was part of the motivation for the offensive. Take their food, take their fuel, take everything they had, and use it to push all the way to Antwerp. It sounded good in theory. Ernst wasn't sure he believed it anymore, but he didn't say that out loud. You didn't say things like that out loud, not if you wanted to avoid uncomfortable conversations with the SS officers attached to their division. The offensive pushed forward through snow and resistance, and by the afternoon of the second day, Klaus's squad was ordered to probe a section of forest where American resistance had suddenly collapsed. They moved carefully through the trees, expecting an ambush at every moment. The forest was silent except for distant artillery and the crunch of their boots in fresh snow. No ambush came. Instead, they found an abandoned American supply point. It wasn't a major depot, just a forward distribution site, the kind of place where supplies were broken down and sent to frontline positions. It had been evacuated in a hurry. Crates and boxes were scattered everywhere, some opened, some still sealed. A truck sat abandoned with its engine still warm, keys in the ignition, cargo half unloaded. The Americans had left in such a rush that they hadn't even attempted to destroy what they couldn't take. Klaus approached the first crate cautiously, his weapon ready, half expecting booby traps. He pried it open with his bayonet and stared at the contents. Canned peaches. Dozens of cans, each one labeled in English with a colorful picture of perfect fruit. He opened another crate. Chocolate bars. Hundreds of them, each one wrapped individually in brown paper and foil. Another crate revealed cigarettes. American cigarettes, packed in sealed tins to keep them dry. Each tin contained 4 packs. There were dozens of tins. Klaus looked around at his squad mates, saw the same expression of disbelief on every face. This was a forward supply point. This wasn't even a main depot. This was just where they staged things before sending them to the actual frontline soldiers. And it contained more food than Klaus had seen in months. More food than some German rear area depots contained. Just sitting here in the snow, abandoned because the Americans apparently couldn't be bothered to load it all during their retreat. Ernst arrived with the rest of the platoon and immediately began organizing the salvage operation. His training as a baker had made him meticulous, and he approached the American supplies with the same careful attention he had once given to inventory in his shop. He made lists, he counted items, and as he counted, a cold realization settled in his stomach. The Americans weren't just well supplied, they were abundantly supplied, wastefully supplied, impossibly supplied. There were crates of fresh oranges, already starting to freeze in the winter cold. Fresh oranges, shipped across an ocean, transported hundreds of miles through combat zones, and trucked to the front lines of a battle. Who did that? Who had the capacity to ship fresh fruit to frontline troops in the middle of winter? Ernst picked up an orange and turned it over in his hands. It was real. It was actually real. Somewhere, someone had packed these oranges knowing they would travel thousands of miles to feed soldiers who might be dead before they could eat them. And they had done it anyway, because apparently they could afford to. Then someone called out from the back of the supply area. They had found the bread. It was in the abandoned truck, stacked in wooden crates lined with waxed paper. Loaves of white bread, each one wrapped in paper printed with a date and a code. Ernst approached slowly, almost afraid to confirm what he suspected. He picked up the nearest loaf and read the wrapper. December 16th, 1944. Yesterday. This bread had been baked yesterday. He unwrapped it with shaking hands and pressed his fingers into the crust. It yielded slightly. The interior was soft. This wasn't preserved bread or emergency rations. This was fresh bread. Real bread. The kind you bought from a bakery on a normal morning in a normal world. Ernst broke open the loaf and the smell hit him like a physical blow. Yeast. Flour. That unmistakable scent of real bread. Not hardtack. Not ersatz anything. Actual bread made from actual wheat with actual yeast. Baked within the last 24 hours. And transported to a frontline supply point as casually as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Klaus took a piece when Ernst offered it. The texture was impossible. It was soft. It compressed slightly when he squeezed it. It didn't require soaking or breaking or any of the survival techniques German soldiers had developed for dealing with hardtack. He bit into it, and the flavor was almost painful in its normalcy. Mild, slightly sweet, the taste of actual wheat instead of whatever ingredients went into survival biscuits. He chewed slowly, and for just a moment he wasn't a soldier in a frozen forest. He was human again, eating real food like a real person. Then the moment passed, and reality returned. This was enemy bread. The people he was trying to kill ate this every day. They ate fresh bread every day while he ate biscuits that had been manufactured before some of the men in his squad had even been drafted. The Americans had logistics sophisticated enough to deliver fresh bread to forward positions in winter conditions through contested territory. Fresh bread, not as a special treat, not for holidays, every day, as standard procedure. Over the next hour they cataloged what they had captured. The numbers were staggering and got worse the more Ernst counted. There were 50 crates of bread, each containing a dozen loaves. 600 loaves of fresh bread, all dated within the last 2 days. There were cases of coffee, real coffee, vacuum sealed in tins that hissed when you opened them. There were cigarettes enough for every man in the company to have a full pack with cases left over. There were canned fruits and vegetables, chocolate bars by the hundreds, cheese that didn't need refrigeration, dried milk that actually tasted like milk when you mixed it with water. There were medical supplies that made the company medic actually stop and stare. Sulfa powder in quantities the entire battalion hadn't seen in months. Morphine syrettes, dozens of them, each one individually wrapped and labeled. Bandages that were actually clean and sterile. Antiseptic in bottles instead of tiny vials. The Americans supplied their frontline aid stations better than German field hospitals were supplied. Their forward positions had better medicine than German rear areas. Ernst tried to calculate the logistics in his head, and couldn't make it work. The bread had been baked somewhere behind the American lines, probably in a field bakery, then loaded onto trucks and driven forward through winter weather and combat conditions to reach this distribution point. From here it would have been broken down further, and sent to individual units, probably on a daily basis. That meant they were baking bread every day. Thousands of loaves. Maybe tens of thousands. They were baking it, transporting it, and distributing it to frontline soldiers as routine procedure. Not as a special occasion. Not as a morale boost. As standard operating procedure. The German logistics system couldn't do that. Ernst knew because he had watched it fail repeatedly over the past year. They couldn't get ammunition forward consistently. They couldn't get fuel forward consistently. They relied on horse-drawn carts for much of their transport, because they didn't have enough trucks or enough fuel for the trucks they had. The idea of baking thousands of loaves daily, and trucking them to the front was beyond the capacity of the Wehrmacht in December 1944. It would have been beyond their capacity in 1942 when things were still going well. Yet here was the evidence that the Americans did it routinely. So routinely that they had abandoned 600 loaves of fresh bread rather than waste time loading it during a tactical retreat. 600 loaves. That wasn't even a major loss to them. This was one small supply point among hundreds. They would just bake more bread tomorrow and truck it forward to replace what had been lost today. The abundance was casual, thoughtless, the way a rich man might leave small change on a counter because it wasn't worth the effort to pocket it. Klaus found the supply manifest in the truck's cab. They were printed forms, filled out in duplicate with carbon paper, listing everything that had been delivered to this point and when. He couldn't read English well, but he could read numbers and dates. The bread deliveries were daily. Every single day there was a line item for bread, with quantities that made him recalculate twice because surely he was reading wrong. He wasn't reading wrong. The Americans were delivering fresh bread to this one supply point every day, in quantities sufficient to feed several companies. And this was just one supply point. There must be dozens of them, hundreds of them, thousands of them, stretching back through Belgium and France all the way to the coast. The cigarettes bothered Ernst almost as much as the bread. They were packaged in sealed tins, 4 packs to a tin, waterproof and airtight. Good cigarettes too. Name brands he had heard of even before the war. Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield. They weren't made from floor sweepings and tobacco dust like the cigarettes German soldiers received when they received cigarettes at all. These were quality products, manufactured to civilian standards, the kind of thing you bought in a shop in peacetime. And they were being distributed to soldiers in combat zones in such quantities that American troops could afford to leave cases of them behind during a retreat. Someone found American K-rations in another crate, the individual meal packets that American soldiers carried. Each packet contained a complete meal with crackers, canned meat, dried fruit, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. Everything a soldier needed for a day, packaged together in a waterproof box small enough to fit in a pack. Ernst opened one and examined the contents. The crackers were fresh. The chocolate was real chocolate, not the ersatz version made with vegetable oils. The coffee was actual coffee. Even the cigarettes were name brand. This was an emergency ration. This was what American soldiers ate when they couldn't get hot meals. And it was better than what German soldiers ate when German logistics was working perfectly. The Americans had systematized abundance to the point where their worst-case scenario was better than the Wehrmacht's best-case scenario. That realization hit Ernst harder than any artillery barrage. They weren't fighting an enemy. They were fighting a system, a machine, an industrial complex that could produce and distribute resources at a scale that made German efforts look like a village market compared to a factory. Lieutenant Vogel arrived to inspect the captured supplies and immediately ordered everything loaded onto German transport for evacuation. But there wasn't enough German transport. There were only 2 trucks available, and they were already loaded with ammunition. The company had advanced faster than its supply line could follow, which was the story of the Wehrmacht in 1944. Everything was always just out of reach, just too far forward, just beyond the capacity of horse carts and fuel shortages to deliver. Ernst watched as Vogel made the calculations, saw the officer's face tighten as he realized they couldn't take it all. They couldn't even take half of it. They would have to choose. Ammunition or food, fuel or medical supplies. Every choice meant leaving American abundance behind in the forest to rot or be recaptured. They were like children in a candy store who could only carry what fit in their pockets. The store would still be full when they left. They would just be slightly less hungry for a few days. In the end, they took what they could carry on foot. Each man filled his pack with American rations, grabbed as many cigarettes as he could stuff in his pockets, and took a share of the bread. They loaded the 2 trucks with the most essential items, priority given to medical supplies and ammunition. Everything else stayed behind. Ernst did the math in his head as they marched away. They had captured perhaps 5% of what had been at that supply point. 5%. And it was enough to make every man in the company feel like he had stumbled into a treasure vault. They left tons of supplies behind. Literal tons. Cases of food and medicine and equipment, abandoned in the snow for the Americans to reclaim, or for the weather to destroy. Ernst looked back as they moved out, and saw the waste, saw the incredible, impossible waste of an army that had so much it could afford to lose mountains of supplies without blinking. The Wehrmacht scavenged shell casings to remelt for new ammunition. The Americans left cases of fresh bread to freeze in Belgian forests. That night, Klaus ate better than he had eaten in half a year. Canned peaches, white bread, real coffee, chocolate for dessert. He shared his bounty with the squad, and they sat in their frozen foxholes eating American rations and trying to understand what it meant. Someone suggested that maybe this had been a special supply dump, gathered for some important operation. Someone else pointed out that the manifests showed daily deliveries, that this was routine. The conversation died after that. No one wanted to think about what it meant if the enemy ate like this every day while the Wehrmacht starved on hardtack and hope. The bread was a revelation. Klaus ate 3 slices and could have eaten more, but Ernst had already started rationing what they had taken, making it last. Even in abundance, German soldiers hoarded. It was instinct now, born from years of shortage. You didn't eat everything at once because you never knew when the next meal would come. But the Americans apparently ate fresh bread every day, which meant they didn't need to hoard. They could eat their fill knowing more would arrive tomorrow on schedule, as reliable as sunrise. Ernst couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about the logistics. The Americans had to ship everything across the Atlantic Ocean. They had to move it through submarine-infested waters, land it at ports, transport it hundreds of miles to the front, and distribute it to individual soldiers. And they did all of that so efficiently that frontline troops ate fresh bread daily. The Germans were fighting in their own backyard, on interior lines, with rail networks they had built themselves. And they couldn't keep their soldiers fed with anything better than 3-week-old hardtack. The math was impossible. The distances were wrong. The Americans were operating on supply lines that stretched across an ocean, and yet they delivered better, fresher food than the Germans could deliver across a few hundred kilometers of European countryside. Either American logistics was impossibly good, or German logistics was catastrophically bad. Probably both. Ernst had seen German supply failures up close for years now, but he had never seen American supply success up close before. The contrast was devastating. The next morning brought more evidence. Klaus's squad overran an American position and found the remnants of breakfast. There were empty cans that had contained scrambled eggs, powdered but recently prepared. There were coffee grounds still wet in a filter. There was half a loaf of bread, the same bread they had found at the supply point, with the same date printed on the wrapper, December 17th, today. This bread had been baked this morning, or possibly late last night, and trucked to the front lines in time for American soldiers to eat it with their breakfast. Klaus picked up the half loaf and examined it closely, as if he might find some evidence of fraud, some proof that it wasn't really fresh. But it was. The crust was still soft. The interior was still moist. He could smell the faint aroma of yeast. This was real bread, fresh bread, combat zone bread delivered on schedule like the mail. The Americans had retreated from this position hours ago, driven back by the German attack. But they had eaten fresh bread for breakfast before they left. While Klaus had eaten hardtack from October, American soldiers had eaten bread baked that morning. They pushed forward throughout the day, and everywhere they found the same pattern. American positions, hastily abandoned, littered with food. Not emergency rations, not survival supplies, actual meals. There were positions where the Americans had been cooking hot food when the attack came. Field kitchens with pots still containing soup, now frozen but clearly recent. There were storage tents with enough provisions to feed a battalion for a week. And everywhere, always, there was bread. Fresh bread. White bread. Bread that had been baked within the last day or two and transported to the front as casually as if Belgium were New Jersey and the front line were a grocery store. One position had been a company headquarters, and they found a field kitchen still set up. There were industrial-sized pots, portable stoves that ran on gasoline, refrigeration units powered by generators. A field kitchen. The Americans had refrigeration in forward positions. Ernst examined the equipment with professional interest. This wasn't improvised. This was purpose-built military equipment, designed and manufactured specifically for feeding troops in combat zones. The stoves were standardized. The pots were standardized. Everything fit together like a system because it was a system. The Germans had field kitchens too, when they had the fuel to run them and the horses to transport them and the time to set them up. The Americans apparently had field kitchens as standard equipment, always present, always operational. There was a menu board on the side of one of the trucks listing meals for the week. Monday, pot roast. Tuesday, fried chicken. Wednesday, meatloaf. Thursday, pork chops. The Americans were serving different hot meals every day of the week. German soldiers got hot meals when logistics permitted and felt grateful. American soldiers apparently had menu options. Feldwebel Baumann had stopped making jokes about American softness. He had stopped repeating the propaganda about American industrial weakness and material shortages. He had seen too much evidence to the contrary. The Americans weren't running out of anything. They were drowning in supplies. They had so much food that they could afford to abandon tons of it during tactical retreats. They had such efficient logistics that they could deliver fresh bread daily to frontline positions in winter conditions through contested territory. And if they could do that with bread, what else could they do? On December 19th, Klaus's company captured a larger American depot, this one not fully evacuated. There were American supply personnel still trying to destroy stocks when the Germans arrived. They gave up quickly when they realized they were surrounded, dropping tools and raising hands without much resistance. The Americans surrendered looking more annoyed than frightened, as if being captured were an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Ernst was assigned to guard detail, and got to observe the prisoners while officers decided what to do with them. The Americans didn't look starved. They didn't look desperate. They looked healthy, well-fed, properly equipped. Their uniforms were in good condition, not patched and repatched like German uniforms. Their boots were intact, actual leather boots that fit properly and kept water out. They had winter coats that looked warm, thick wool with proper insulation. One of them was casually eating a chocolate bar while waiting to be processed, as if POW status were just a minor interruption to his snack schedule. Ernst tried talking to one of them. A corporal who spoke a little German learned from a grandmother in Pennsylvania. He asked about the bread, trying to make the question sound casual. The American looked confused. Yes, they got fresh bread. Usually daily, sometimes every other day if supply runs were disrupted by weather or combat. It came from bakery companies attached to the Quartermaster Corps. They had mobile bakeries that could produce thousands of loaves per day, truck-mounted ovens that moved with the army. The American explained this as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if every army obviously had mobile bakeries producing fresh bread for frontline troops. He seemed genuinely puzzled that Ernst found this remarkable. Didn't the Germans have bakery companies? Ernst explained that no, they had hardtack, biscuits, manufactured months ago and transported forward when possible. The American looked sympathetic, but not understanding. He couldn't quite grasp what it meant to fight a war on hardtack and ersatz coffee. His frame of reference didn't include that possibility. Ernst asked about the logistics, how they moved so much food forward. The corporal shrugged. Trucks, mostly. They had thousands of trucks, tens of thousands. The Red Ball Express alone had over 5,000 trucks running supplies from Normandy to the front, and that was just one supply route. There were others. The southern supply route, the northern supply route. There were trucks everywhere, constant convoys, 24 hours a day, moving ammunition and food and fuel and equipment forward in an endless stream. The American made it sound simple. You loaded the trucks, you drove the trucks, you unloaded the trucks, you drove back for more. Over and over, endlessly, with enough vehicles and enough fuel and enough organization that fresh bread reached the front lines while it was still fresh. It was just logistics, basic logistics. You calculated requirements, allocated resources, established routes, maintained schedules. The American couldn't understand why this seemed impressive. It was just how you ran an army. You made sure your soldiers had what they needed. That was basic command responsibility. Klaus listened to this conversation from a few meters away and felt something crack inside his understanding of the war. The Americans weren't just better supplied. They existed in a completely different universe of logistics. The Wehrmacht moved supplies by horse cart and hoped the fuel lasted long enough for occasional truck transport. The Americans had purpose-built logistics networks with dedicated vehicle fleets running on schedules. The Germans scrounged and improvised and made do. The Americans systematized and optimized and then overbuilt their capacity just to be safe. It wasn't a small difference. It was a fundamental difference in industrial capacity and organizational philosophy. The Americans approached war like they approached manufacturing. You built systems. You standardized processes. You allocated resources efficiently. You measured outputs and adjusted inputs. You treated the whole thing like a giant production problem, and you solved it with American industrial methods. Mass production, interchangeable parts, assembly line thinking, applied to war. That night, eating American rations again, Ernst tried to explain it to his men. The bread wasn't really about bread. The bread was proof of capacity. If they could get fresh bread to the front daily, they could get anything to the front daily. Ammunition, fuel, replacement parts, medical supplies, fresh troops, whatever they needed. They had built a machine that could take resources from factories in America, ship them across an ocean, and deliver them to foxholes in Belgium on a predictable schedule. That wasn't just logistics. That was industrial warfare at a scale the Germans couldn't match and apparently hadn't anticipated. One of the younger soldiers protested. The Americans couldn't be that strong. If they were that strong, why hadn't they won already? Why was the Wehrmacht still fighting? Why had the Ardennes offensive achieved any success at all? Ernst didn't have a good answer. Maybe the Americans were slow. Maybe they were cautious. Maybe they preferred to grind forward methodically rather than risk dramatic breakthroughs. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept Ernst awake at night, maybe they were so strong that they didn't need to hurry. Maybe they could afford to be methodical because they knew the outcome was inevitable. When you had enough resources to send fresh bread to frontline troops daily, you didn't need to rush. You didn't need to gamble. You didn't need desperate offensives or miracle weapons. You just had to keep going, grinding forward, replacing every loss, until the other side ran out of men or bullets or hardtack. It was the mathematics of attrition, and the Americans had so much material that the mathematics would always favor them in the end. By December 21st, the Ardennes offensive was clearly stalling. The promised fuel hadn't materialized because there was no fuel to materialize. The promised supplies hadn't materialized because the Wehrmacht didn't have supplies to send. The German advance was running on captured American stocks, which said everything that needed to be said about the sustainability of the operation. Klaus watched trucks roll past on their way to the rear, loaded with American food and ammunition, keeping the Wehrmacht moving for one more day, one more mile. They were parasites now, surviving on what they could steal from the Americans. And even then, even running on American logistics, they were running out. The captured supplies were finite. The American capacity to produce and ship more supplies was apparently infinite, or close enough to infinite that the difference didn't matter. They would bake more bread tomorrow. They would send more trucks tomorrow. They would deliver more supplies tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, as steady and reliable as a factory production line. Ernst organized the remaining American bread carefully, rationing it to make it last. But bread doesn't last long, even fresh bread. By December 22nd, it was stale. By December 23rd, it was hard. By December 24th, it was no better than the hardtack they had been eating before. And there would be no more. The supply lines had shifted. The Americans had adjusted their positions and secured their logistics. The brief window where German soldiers ate fresh bread had closed, and they were back to 3-week-old biscuits and acorn coffee and the slow grind of inadequate rations. On Christmas Eve, Klaus crouched in a different foxhole in a different part of the forest, eating hardtack again. His pack was empty of American rations. They had eaten them all, or traded them, or lost them during retreats that were starting to happen more frequently. He was back to standard Wehrmacht provisions, which meant he was back to being hungry all the time. Someone had saved a can of American peaches for Christmas, and they passed it around the squad, each man getting one small slice of fruit. It tasted like heaven. It tasted like proof that heaven existed somewhere, just not here, just not for them. The offensive collapsed in early January. Klaus survived. Ernst survived. Many didn't. They retreated through the same forests they had advanced through 3 weeks earlier, passing the same American supply points, now reoccupied and restocked. Klaus saw bread being unloaded from trucks. Fresh bread wrapped in paper, dated January 1945. The Americans were already back to their routines, baking and transporting and distributing, as if the battle had been nothing more than a temporary disruption to normal operations. They hadn't even paused. The machine had kept running through the whole offensive, grinding forward, delivering supplies, maintaining schedules. Months later, in April, Klaus would be captured for real, taken prisoner during the final collapse of the Wehrmacht. He would be processed at a POW camp and given a meal. The meal included fresh bread, white bread, soft bread that didn't require a rifle butt to break apart. He would eat it slowly, savoring every bite, and think about December 1944 when he had learned that the Americans trucked fresh bread to the front daily, while German soldiers ate hardtack from weeks past. He had learned other things too, harder things, about industrial capacity and logistics, and the kind of war you could fight when your factories were on a different continent and your supply lines crossed oceans. But the bread was what he remembered. The bread was the symbol. The bread was proof that they had never really had a chance. You couldn't beat an enemy that delivered fresh bread to frontline troops daily. Not with tactics, not with courage, not with desperation. You could only eat your hardtack and hope for miracles that never came. Ernst would survive the war and return to Cologne, or what was left of it. He would eventually rebuild his bakery, using American flour from Marshall Plan shipments, baking bread for German customers with ingredients provided by the same country that had defeated them. He would sometimes tell the story about finding American bread in the Ardennes, how it had been fresh, how they had delivered it daily, how even in the middle of a battle the Americans had maintained logistics sophisticated enough to get fresh bread to the front. People would nod and change the subject because nobody really wanted to talk about the war anymore. But Ernst remembered. He remembered because he was a baker, and he understood what it meant. Fresh bread wasn't magic. Fresh bread was system and process and capacity. Fresh bread was proof of everything else. If they could get bread to the front daily, they could get anything to the front daily. And against an enemy that could do that, an enemy that had systematized abundance, the Wehrmacht had been eating hardtack and hoping for miracles that never came. The Americans had won the war in many places, on many battlefields through many means. But they had also won it in bakeries and truck depots and quartermaster offices, won it by building a logistics system so robust that frontline soldiers never had to eat stale bread unless they chose to. That was the kind of victory that couldn't be countered with tactics or courage or desperation. That was the victory of capacity. The victory of a nation so wealthy and organized that it could send fresh bread across an ocean and through a war zone and still have it arrive soft. Klaus never forgot the taste of that bread in December 1944. It had been good bread, simple white bread, nothing fancy, but it had been fresh. And freshness, in a frozen forest in Belgium during the worst winter in decades, had been the most impossible luxury imaginable. The Americans had made it routine. That was when Klaus had truly understood they were going to lose. If you enjoyed this story of discovery and reluctant